In 1994, a yacht was found rusting in a swamp. It had been missing for 7 years, along with the 3 brothers who sailed it. For the father, Arthur, the phone call came on a Tuesday morning. It was a local sheriff from a parish hundreds of miles from the ocean, a place of still water and hanging moss. The voice on the other end was young, hesitant. He said they had found a boat. He asked if Arthur had ever owned a yacht named the Albatross. The word felt like a stone in Arthur's throat. He hadn't said that name aloud in years. He hadn't let himself even think it. He confirmed that he had. The sheriff paused, and Arthur could hear the rustle of papers. He said the boat was found by a pair of duck hunters, wedged deep in a cypress grove, half sunk in the mud. The paint was peeling. The hull was stained brown with swamp water, but the name was still visible on the stern. Arthur stood in his sterile, quiet kitchen, the phone cold against his ear. 7 years of silence, of empty holidays, and birthdays that passed without notice. 7 years of staring at the sea, imagining a storm, a rogue wave, a tragic but simple end. He had made a kind of peace with that story. It was a story of nature, of bad luck. But a swamp? Swamps were not the ocean. They were endings of a different kind, stagnant, secret, and slow. The sheriff was still talking, saying something about sending a team to secure it, about an investigation. Arthur barely heard him. His mind was back in 1987. He saw his 3 sons standing on the dock. Michael, the oldest at 22, confident and strong, telling him not to worry. Daniel, 19, with a wild grin, already holding a beer. And Sam, just 17, quiet and observant, carrying a book he would probably never open. They were just going for a weekend trip, they said. A last blast of summer before they all had to get serious about their lives. Arthur had stood on the shore, waved them off, and watched the Albatross become a white speck on the blue horizon. He never saw them again. Now, the white speck had reappeared as a wreck in a muddy grave. The story he had told himself for 7 years began to crumble. Why was it there? How did a vessel built for the open ocean find its way into a landlocked marsh? The sheriff cleared his throat, pulling Arthur back to the present. He asked, "Sir, are you still there?" Arthur could only manage one word. "Yes." A heavy silence filled the line before the sheriff spoke again, his voice softer now. He said, "Mr. Maxwell, there's something else. We've been over the boat. There's no sign of them. No remains. It's empty, but it's not clean. There are things here that don't make sense." Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a feeling he hadn't felt since the first week they were missing. It wasn't the grief of loss. It was the fear of the unknown. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. The sheriff hesitated. He said, "It's hard to describe over the phone, but the compass is smashed. Not from a storm. It looks like it was done on purpose. And there's a mark on the deck. A deep gouge in the wood, right next to the main cabin door. It looks like something heavy was dragged." The image flashed in Arthur's mind, a clean, polished deck, now scarred. The single detail was more terrifying than the thought of a storm. A storm was random. A scar was deliberate. It was a clue. And after 7 years of nothing, a clue was the most dangerous thing in the world. It was a seed of hope, and he knew that hope was the thing that could truly destroy him. Arthur drove for 6 hours, the landscape changing from coastal highways to narrow back roads flanked by walls of impenetrable green. He didn't stop. The coffee he'd bought grew cold in the cup holder. He found the site cordoned off with yellow tape, flashing lights painting the mossy trees in strobing blues and reds, and there it was, the Albatross. The sight of it stole the air from his lungs. It was worse than he had imagined. The proud, sleek vessel he had bought for his family was a wounded animal, listing in the dark water, its white hull now a mess of rust, algae, and mud. The mast was snapped, but not in a way a storm would do it. It was clean, almost surgical. He saw the sheriff, a man younger than his own oldest son would have been, who introduced himself as Deputy Evans. He had a tired, sympathetic look in his eyes. He led Arthur past the tape, onto a temporary floating dock they had set up. "I'm sorry you have to see it like this, Mr. Maxwell," Evans said. Arthur didn't respond. He couldn't take his eyes off the boat. It felt like looking at a ghost. As he stepped aboard, the deck groaned under his weight. The smell was overpowering: decay, stagnant water, wet rot. Evans pointed to the gouge he'd mentioned on the phone. It was deep, a splintered wound in the teak decking that ran for about 3 feet before stopping at the cabin door. It wasn't from gears sliding around. It was a straight, ugly line, Evans said. Forensics is looking at it. They think it was made by metal, maybe a footlocker, or an engine part. But we can't find anything on board that matches it. Arthur ran his hand over the splintered wood. He thought of Sam, his youngest, who had helped him sand and seal that very deck the summer before they vanished. He remembered the boy's careful hands, his quiet pride in the work. He felt a wave of dizziness. Evans led him toward the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, swollen shut from the humidity. 2 officers had to pry it open. The inside was a mess of mildew and muck. The cushions were dark with mold. The table was overturned, and a layer of silty brown water covered the floor. But through the chaos, something was wrong, disturbingly wrong. On a small shelf above the galley, a stack of paperback books was still sitting there, warped but upright. A half-empty bottle of rum stood on the counter, uncapped but not spilled. In the sleeping quarters, clothes were still folded in an open duffel bag. These were not the signs of a boat tossed in a violent storm. This was a boat that had been abandoned, left, perhaps even parked. An older man in a plain suit approached them. He introduced himself as Detective Harris. He was retired, he explained, but had been the lead on the original missing persons case in 1987. He had driven up from the coast as soon as he heard the news. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He didn't offer condolences, just a firm handshake. He said, "It never sat right with me, this case." "A sudden squall," the Coast Guard said. "But Michael was a good sailor. You taught him yourself." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "He was the best," he said. Harris gestured around the cabin. "This isn't a storm, Arthur. This is something else." He then pointed to a small, locked cabinet beneath the navigation station. "We haven't been able to get this open yet. It's a custom lock, not standard on this model. Did you install it?" Arthur shook his head. "No, that cabinet was always just a simple latch. For flares and first aid." He had never seen that lock before in his life. Harris and Evans exchanged a look. Someone had modified his boat. Someone had put a lock on a cabinet that was meant to hold life-saving equipment. A cold, terrifying thought began to form in Arthur's mind. What if the danger wasn't from the ocean? What if they had brought it on board with them? They brought in a locksmith from the nearest town, a thin, older man who seemed unnerved by the police presence and the grim location. He worked on the custom lock for nearly an hour, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Arthur and Harris stood back, the silence broken only by the click and scrape of the locksmith's tools. Every sound echoed in the damp cabin. Arthur's mind raced. What could be in there? Flares? A logbook? Something that would tell him finally what happened? Or was it just another dead end? Another piece of the puzzle that led nowhere? The locksmith finally grunted in satisfaction. The lock clicked open. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants, and nodded at Harris. The detective pulled on a pair of latex gloves and slowly opened the small cabinet door. Arthur leaned in, his heart pounding against his ribs. It wasn't what he expected. There were no flares, no first aid kit, no emergency radio. Instead, the small space was packed tight with rolled-up nautical charts. But they weren't for the local area. They were for coastlines far to the south, and they were covered in markings. Strange, handwritten notes and lines that didn't follow any standard shipping lanes. They pointed to desolate coves and unmarked inlets, places a pleasure yacht had no reason to go. Beneath the maps was a single, leather-bound logbook. It wasn't the official ship's log Arthur kept on board. This was smaller, more personal. Harris carefully lifted it out. It was damp, but the pages inside were mostly protected. He opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was Michael's. Arthur recognized his son's sharp, decisive script instantly. But the words were chilling. The date at the top of the page was August 14th, 1987. Arthur's blood ran cold. That was 3 days after the Coast Guard had officially called off the search. 3 days after his sons had been declared lost at sea. The entry was short, just a few lines. It read, "Meeting pushed. Tomorrow night. The fish house. He says the money is good. D is nervous. S doesn't understand. Told them it's fine. One time, and we're done." Harris read the words aloud, his voice low and flat. "The fish house? Does that mean anything to you?" Arthur shook his head, numb. He had no idea what it meant. It sounded like a restaurant, but the context felt sinister. The money is good. What money? They didn't need money. He had given them everything. And the initials. D and S. Daniel and Sam. D is nervous. S doesn't understand. The image was so clear it was painful. Daniel, the reckless one, suddenly afraid. Sam, the innocent one, completely in the dark. Michael was hiding something. He had taken his younger brothers into something dangerous, something that had nothing to do with a weekend sailing trip. The official story, the one Arthur had clung to, a story of a tragic accident, was a lie. This was a story of a secret meeting, of money, of fear. His son, the responsible one, had been leading a life he knew nothing about. Harris closed the logbook gently. He looked at Arthur, his professional demeanor softening for a moment. "I think," he said, "we've been looking for the wrong thing for 7 years. We were looking for a shipwreck. We should have been looking for a crime scene." The swamp, the snapped mast, the locked cabinet, it was all starting to make a dark, horrifying kind of sense. The boat wasn't left here by accident. It was brought here. It was hidden. The discovery of the logbook changed everything. For 7 years, Arthur's grief had been a heavy, shapeless fog. Now it had a focus. It was sharp and cold and pointed. He left the swamp that day with a photocopy of the logbook entry, the words burning in his mind. The fish house. The money is good. He went home not to the empty mansion that echoed with memories, but to his study. For the first time in years, he didn't pour himself a drink. He sat at his large desk and began to work. He started with Michael. He pulled out old photo albums, yearbooks, anything that might hold a clue about the son he thought he knew. He saw the smiling, confident boy, the star athlete, the business student who was supposed to take over the family empire. But as he looked deeper, he started to see cracks in the facade. He remembered small things. Michael becoming more private in his last year of college. Vague answers about where he was going or who he was with. Arthur had chalked it up to a young man wanting his own life, his own independence. Now he saw it as secrecy. He called Michael's old college roommate, a man he hadn't spoken to since the funeral service they'd held without bodies. The man was hesitant at first, but Arthur's desperation was a powerful tool. He asked him, "Did Michael ever have money problems?" The line went quiet for a moment. Then the roommate sighed. He said, "Look, Mr. Maxwell." Michael was proud. He never wanted to be seen as just the rich kid living off his dad. He made some bad investments, got in over his head with some people. I told him to just ask you for help, but he refused. He said he had a plan to fix it all himself. A big one. The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. His son drowning in debt and too proud to tell him. What kind of people had he gotten involved with? What was this plan? Meanwhile, Detective Harris, officially back on the case in a consulting role, was hitting his own walls. The local authorities in the parish where the yacht was found were treating it as a cold case with little priority. Resources were scarce. He told Arthur over the phone, "They think it's simple. The boys got into something bad, it went wrong, and the boat was dumped. To them, it's just another story about rich kids playing with fire. They don't have the manpower to dig into a 7-year-old mystery." Harris sounded frustrated, tired. Arthur could feel the investigation slipping away, becoming another cold file in a dusty cabinet. He knew he couldn't let that happen. He told Harris, "Then, I'll provide the manpower. I'll provide the resources. I'll pay for whatever it takes." He hired a team of private investigators, the best money could buy. he turned his grief into a machine, an engine fueled by unanswered questions and a father's rage. They started with the logbook's clues. The fish house was generic. There were dozens of places with that name up and down the coast, but the maps found in the locked cabinet provided a focus. They detailed a specific, remote stretch of coastline, 100 miles north of their home port. It was an area known in the 80s for its crumbling infrastructure and lack of police oversight. The investigators cross-referenced the maps with old business directories from 1987, and they found it. Tucked away on a forgotten bayou, accessible only by water or a long unpaved road, was a defunct business, the Bayou Fish Oyster Company. The locals, according to an old fisherman they interviewed, had just called it the Fish House. It had been closed down for years, even back in the 80s. It was the perfect place for a meeting someone didn't want observed. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, a real place, a destination. He told his lead investigator he was going there. The investigator advised against it, saying they should handle it. It could be dangerous. Arthur's response was flat and final. My sons walked into that place. I'm going to as well. He didn't know what he was looking for. An answer? A ghost? But he knew he had to stand in the last place his boys had been. He had to breathe the same air and see what they saw on their final night. He drove alone, the coordinates from his investigators programmed into a new GPS unit. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track nearly swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. The air grew thick and humid, smelling of salt and decay. After another mile, the track ended abruptly at a clearing, and there it was, the fish house. It was a collection of dilapidated buildings sagging on stilts over the murky water of the bayou. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood a silver gray. The windows were shattered, dark eyes staring out at nothing. The place felt dead, but alive with menace. A heavy silence hung over it, broken only by the buzz of insects. Arthur got out of the car, his hand resting on the tire iron he'd brought from the trunk. He walked onto the rickety pier that connected the buildings. The wood groaned under his feet. He pushed open the door to the main processing building. It swung inward with a long, painful screech. The inside was a cavernous space filled with the ghosts of industry. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling. Conveyor belts were frozen in place, covered in dust and grime. A shaft of light from a hole in the roof illuminated a section of the concrete floor, and Arthur saw it. Dark stains on the concrete. They were old, faded, but unmistakable. He knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't rust or oil. He walked closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The investigators had told him to wait, to let them sweep the area first, but he couldn't. He felt drawn forward by a terrible gravity. Near the stains, he saw something else. Small, metallic objects glinting in the dim light. He knelt down, his knees cracking. They were shell casings, dozens of them, scattered across the floor like dropped pennies. He picked one up. It was a strange caliber, something he didn't recognize from his own hunting days. This wasn't a meeting that went wrong. This was a firefight, a one-sided one. Panic began to set in, a claustrophobic terror. He had to get out. He turned to leave, to run back to his car and call Harris. But as he turned, his foot kicked something small that had been hidden in the shadows beneath a rusted processing table. It skittered across the floor and came to a stop in the beam of light. It was a shoe. A single small canvas deck shoe, white, with blue laces. Arthur stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to see the size. He didn't need to check for a name. He knew that shoe. He had bought it for his youngest son, Sam, 2 weeks before the trip. Sam had complained they were too plain, and his mother had helped him swap out the white laces for blue ones, his favorite color. For 7 years, Arthur had held onto a sliver of hope. A fantasy that his sons had run away, started a new life, that one day they would call or come home. He had imagined them lost at sea, taken by the elements. But this single shoe, in this violent, derelict place, destroyed all of that. It told the real story. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't an escape. It was an execution. All the air left his body. and he fell to his knees on the cold, stained concrete, the little shoe in his hand. The hope that had sustained him, the hope that had been rekindled by the discovery of the yacht, was now gone forever. In its place was a certainty more terrible than any mystery. The discovery of the shoe and the casings galvanized the investigation. Arthur's private team, working with a reluctant but now obligated Detective Harris, turned the abandoned fish plant into a full-blown crime scene. They swept every inch of the decaying structure. The forensics report came back a week later, and it was grim. The bloodstains on the floor were too degraded for a perfect DNA match after so many years, but the blood type was consistent with two of his sons, Michael and Daniel. Sam's blood type wasn't found, but that offered little comfort. The shell casings were the real breakthrough. They were from a 9mm Makarov, a Soviet-era pistol. In the late 80s, it was an uncommon weapon in the United States, favored almost exclusively by a specific type of criminal: Eastern Bloc smugglers and arms dealers who were starting to make inroads on the Gulf Coast. The theory of a simple deal gone bad now had a face, a very dangerous international face. Harris, now fully invested, pulled old files from the archives. He found a series of unsolved cargo ship hijackings and smuggling busts from 1986 to 1988. The perpetrators were known to be violent and professional. In one of those files, he found a mention of a 9mm Makarov being used. The pieces were slotting together into a picture of terrifying clarity. Michael, desperate for money and respect, had tried to play in a league he couldn't possibly comprehend. He likely offered them the Albatross as a transport vessel for a single high-value run, a way to make a fortune overnight. He had brought his brothers along, maybe as his crew, or maybe just because he couldn't leave them behind. Daniel, the wild card. Sam, the innocent baggage. The meeting at the fish house was the exchange. But something went wrong. Maybe the smugglers decided they didn't need witnesses. Maybe they decided to keep the boat and the money. Arthur's grief had now hardened into something else. It was a cold, precise engine of vengeance. He no longer cared about mourning. He cared about names. He wanted the people responsible. The question of ransom came up again. Harris asked him, "Are you absolutely certain you never received a call? No note? Nothing?" Arthur was adamant. "Never. I would have paid anything. I would have given them everything." But the phone never rang. This puzzled Harris. A professional crew like this wouldn't just commit murder for no reason. Kidnapping a millionaire's sons for ransom would have been the logical play. Violence was a last resort, bad for business. Why the shootout? The answer came from the financial investigators Arthur had hired. They had been digging into his complex network of offshore accounts and family trusts for weeks, and they found it. An anomaly. A single massive wire transfer out of a trust fund Arthur had set up for Michael. It was for $250,000. The transfer was initiated by Michael himself, using a power of attorney Arthur had given him for his studies. And the date of the withdrawal was 2 days before they left on the yacht. Arthur stared at the financial statement, his hands shaking. It wasn't a kidnapping. They never asked for a ransom because they already had the money. Michael hadn't been an unwilling victim. He had been a partner. He had stolen from his own family trust to fund a deal with killers, believing he could control the outcome. The $250,000 wasn't a ransom payment. It was the buy-in. And his sons' lives were the price of his failure. The weight of this new knowledge was crushing. It recontextualized everything. The prideful arguments, the requests for independence, the secrecy. It wasn't about a young man finding his way. It was about a young man losing it and dragging his brothers down with him. The betrayal felt sharper than any bullet. It was a wound inflicted by his own son. The investigation now had a clear, if horrifying, narrative. Michael Maxwell, in an act of profound arrogance and desperation, had entered into a partnership with a dangerous smuggling ring. He provided the money and the transport, his family's yacht. They were to provide the illicit goods. The meeting at the fish house was the rendezvous. But for professional criminals, a rich, naive kid with a boat is not a partner. He's a liability, a loose end. The violence was not a negotiation tactic. It was the business plan. They took the money, they took the boat, and they eliminated the witnesses. The question that haunted Arthur and Harris was, who were they? The smuggling ring from the 80s was a ghost. Most of the players were likely dead, in prison, or had vanished back into the shadows they came from. For months, Arthur's investigators and Harris chased down cold leads. They interviewed retired customs agents, aging dock workers, and small-time criminals from that era. They got whispers, rumors, street names that led nowhere. The trail was getting colder by the day. It felt like they were hunting specters. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from a database or a forensic report. It came from a man. Harris, through a series of confidential informants, tracked down a former low-level associate of the ring, a man named Yuri, now in his late 60s, living a quiet life, running a small bait and tackle shop 2 states away. He had served time for unrelated charges and had been out for over a decade. He wanted nothing to do with his old life. Harris and Arthur went to see him. They didn't go as cops or investigators. They went as 2 old men looking for an answer. They found Yuri on a rickety porch overlooking a channel, mending a fishing net. His hands were gnarled, his face a roadmap of a hard life. At first, he denied everything. He didn't know the names, he didn't know the place. But Arthur didn't threaten him. He didn't offer money. He simply sat down on the porch steps, the years of grief heavy on his shoulders, and he told Yuri about his sons. He spoke of Sam and his blue shoelaces. He spoke of Daniel and his reckless grin. He spoke of Michael and his foolish pride. He asked one question. Just tell me what happened to them. I need to know how it ended. The raw, unvarnished pain in the father's voice seemed to break through the old man's defenses. Yuri stopped mending his net. He stared out at the water for a long time. Then, in a low, heavily accented voice, he began to talk. He wasn't there that night, he said, but he heard the story from the men who were. It happened just as they suspected. The kid Michael showed up with his brothers. He was cocky. He thought he was a businessman. He started making demands, trying to change the terms of the deal last minute. He misread the room completely. An argument started. The leader of the crew, a man Yuri would only call the captain, gave a signal. It was over in seconds. Michael and the youngest boy, Sam, were killed in the initial volley of gunfire. They never stood a chance. Arthur closed his eyes. The confirmation, a physical blow. He felt a strange sense of relief mixed with the horror. At least he knew. The uncertainty was gone. But then, Yuri kept talking, and the story took a darker turn. He said, but the other one? The middle one, Daniel. He was tougher, or maybe just luckier. He was wounded in the arm, but he fought back. He managed to knock one of the men down before they subdued him. The captain was impressed by his fire. He saw a use for him. Yuri paused, his gaze fixed on the distant water. He seemed reluctant to continue, as if the memory itself was a burden. Arthur waited, his entire being focused on the old man's next words. He had just found 2 of his sons, only to lose them again in the bloody retelling of their final moments. But what about Daniel, the one who fought back, the one who survived? Yuri finally let out a long, slow breath. He said, the captain had a problem. They had the money, they had the boat, but killing the sons of a man like you, that brings heat. The kind of heat that's bad for business. He was worried you might have known something about the deal, that you might have people looking for them. So they took the other boy, Daniel. He was insurance. Leverage. They cleaned up the fish house, took the bodies of his brothers out to sea, and scuttled the yacht in that swamp to hide it. The plan was to hold Daniel, to see if anyone came asking questions. If you had sent the cops, or other tough guys, they would have sent you a piece of him as a warning to back off. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. His son hadn't died in a quick, violent burst. He had been taken. He had been a prisoner, a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. Did you ever use him? Did you call me? Arthur's voice was a ragged whisper. Yuri shook his head. No. Weeks went by. Nothing happened. No cops, No investigators, just silence. The news reports all said the same thing: a tragic boating accident, lost at sea. The captain realized his mistake. He had overestimated the kid, Michael. He thought he was part of some bigger operation, that he had told his powerful father about the plan. But he was just a stupid kid, acting alone. You weren't looking for them because you didn't know there was anything to look for. Daniel, the hostage, was now worthless. Worse, he was a witness, a living link to the murders of his brothers. So, what did you do with him? Arthur asked, dreading the answer. Yuri looked away, his jaw tight. I don't know. I was out of the loop by then. I heard rumors. That's all. Some said they sold him to another crew, down in South America. Human trafficking. Others said the captain got tired of feeding him and just finished the job. No one knows for sure. He was just gone. After that, the crew broke up. The captain disappeared. The whole operation dissolved. Yuri had given them the truth, but it was a fractured, incomplete truth. 2 of his sons were murdered in a derelict fish plant. Their bodies were at the bottom of the ocean. His 3rd son, Daniel, had survived, only to be swallowed by a darkness far more profound. His fate was a permanent question mark, a new and more terrible kind of unknown. The hope Arthur had felt when the yacht was found, the hope that had turned to rage at the fish house, now collapsed into a new, hollow grief. He had the what, but not the who. He had the how, but not the where. He had found one story, only to uncover another, more painful one, with an ending that would never be written. The drive back from the bait shop was silent. Harris tried to speak a few times, to offer procedural comfort, to talk about next steps, but the words died in the heavy air of the car. Arthur just stared out the window, the landscape a blur. He had started this journey to find his sons. In a way, he had. He found them in a rusted yacht, in a blood-stained building, in the fragmented story of a tired old criminal. He knew now that Michael's pride had been his downfall, that Sam's innocence had offered him no protection. They were gone. But Daniel was lost in a different way. He was an echo, a ghost trapped in a rumor. That night, Arthur didn't go to his study. He walked down to the private dock behind his house, the same one his sons had sailed from all those years ago. The air was cool, the water black and calm under the moon. For 7 years, he had looked at this water and seen a storm, an act of God. Now he saw a crime scene. He saw a gateway his sons had used to sail away from him forever. He thought of the $250,000, money he would have given Michael without a second thought, had he only asked. It was a fortune to a young man, but to Arthur, it was little more than pocket change. The irony was devastating. His son had destroyed his entire family for a sum of money that wouldn't have mattered. The secrets, the pride, the desperate need to prove himself, that was the real killer. The smugglers were just the weapon. Harris had promised to keep looking. He would try to find the captain, to chase the rumor of Daniel's fate, but they both knew it was a fool's errand. The trail was nearly a decade old. The men responsible had scattered to the winds. There would be no trial, no justice in a courtroom. The only justice was the story itself, the terrible truth that Arthur now carried alone. He thought about the yacht, the albatross. In the poem, the albatross was a sign of good luck, and killing it brought a curse upon the sailors. Michael had metaphorically killed his family's trust, their safety. He had brought the curse on board with him. The boat, left to rot in a stagnant swamp, was a fitting tombstone for his ambition. It was a monument to a secret. In the weeks that followed, Arthur began the slow, painful process of dismantling his life's work. He sold his company. He put the large house up for sale. The empire he had built, the one he had intended to pass on to his sons, now felt like a hollow shell. What was the point of a legacy with no one to leave it to? He kept only one thing from the investigation: the small, canvas deck shoe with the blue laces. It sat on the mantelpiece of his new, smaller home. It was a constant, brutal reminder, not of what he had lost, but of what was taken. It was the period at the end of a story he could finally understand. He never knew what truly happened to Daniel. The uncertainty was a special kind of torment, a wound that could never scar over. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would allow himself a sliver of impossible hope that Daniel had escaped, that he had survived and built a new life somewhere, afraid to come home. But he knew it was a lie. The world that had swallowed his son did not give people back. He was gone. The case of the millionaire's sons was closed, but it was never solved. It was just over. Arthur lived out the rest of his years in quiet solitude, a man haunted not by the sea, but by the secrets that lie beneath the calm surface of a family. Have you ever heard of a case where the official story just didn't add up? Share your thoughts below.